Switching gears just a little bit, Ukraine's president, Volodymyr Zelenskyy, recently mocked Donald Trump, saying, "Oh, you think you're so great, you could end this war in 24 hours. You don't know anything. President Biden could end this war in 5 minutes if it were possible. But both of you are going to demand that Ukraine give up territory, and we will never do that." Um, is this war going to end like most wars, where they are forced to give up territory and move on from the bad feelings? And do you know why Zelensky would feel it necessary to take a jab at Trump?
Trump is saying something which he fears, and you're right. The way you stop this war is the president of the United States sends a message to Moscow and says, we are suspending all further aid deliveries to Ukraine, number one. That's very important. Number two, we are withdrawing all U.S. military personnel, intelligence personnel from Ukraine. In other words, we're getting out of Ukraine and we're suspending all aid. If we do that, what do you think our allies are going to do? They're going to do the same thing.
Yeah.
Now, once the Russians see that that's true, then they'll meet with us. And that's where we sit down and say, look, this is yours. You get to keep it. But this is what we want. And the Russians will say, well, we're going to keep what you mentioned, but we want neutrality for whatever remains of Ukraine. Whatever that turns out to be, everything west of the Dnieper River or everything but Odessa west of the Dnieper River. And that's something that Zelenskyy fears, because he's made all of these promises and bloviated, and he's been backed by a lot of people on that basis. Remember, there's a wonderful photograph of him sitting in Kiev talking to this Bank Friedman character, the crook that stole, billions of dollars and then fed it to the leftist machine. He's there talking to him, and on the video screen is Larry Fink of BlackRock. And these people are talking. What are they talking about? Well, Zelensky signing contracts that turn over vast stretches of territory in Ukraine, some of the most fertile farmland in the world, to many of the firms like Cargill and Monsanto and others who deal in those things. Remember, who owns shares in all of that? BlackRock. And BlackRock is also interested in reconstruction. Now, I don't know what you think, but I think that if they lose this war and we actually talk to the Russians, a lot of those contracts will be null and void. A lot of the promised funds won't show up. He knows that too. So he's in this extraordinarily desperate situation. He's disintegrating. His forces in ruins. Hundreds of thousands of people have been killed for nothing. He's achieved nothing. The Russians are now stronger than they've ever been, far stronger than we thought they could be, based upon our false assumptions about Russia. Remember, we said Russia is really unchanged from what it was in the 1990s. We've gotten an education the hard way. Bears no resemblance to that at all. And we don't want a war with China and Russia and anybody else who may join it. That's something we don't want. The Germans don't want it. The French don't want it. So the bottom line is he knows that all of these things are now possible. So he's going to defend, the last inch of ground with his life. At least that's what he thinks, or that's what he says. So it doesn't work. It won't work.
Okay. So I don't know if Zelenskyy was caught off guard by Biden going to the press with this NATO meeting and saying, we're not letting Ukraine into NATO. It's not going to happen. They're not ready for multiple reasons. Zelenskyy looked like a balloon that had the air let out of it. Do you think he was caught off guard? And why do you think NATO doesn't want Ukraine to join at this time, or maybe ever?
Well, first, keep in mind that, we say NATO, but everything turns on Washington. Stoltenberg doesn't say anything unless it's cleared through the White House. And all the Europeans are, as I said before, they're like vassals. They're pathetic. They stand around and wait to be directed by Washington. And I keep trying to tell the Germans, who are friends of mine and others, Why don't you wake up? You at least you had good sense in the 60s and the 70s to stay out of Vietnam. So did the British. Prime Minister Macmillan made it abundantly clear that Britain would not go to Vietnam. Well, thank God. They avoided that catastrophe. What happened? Now you blindly follow wherever Washington leads. Well, we know they're all part of the same class of globalists that want to do the same things, destroy our societies, frankly, which are doing a pretty damn good job of right now. But I think I think he was shocked because I think he's now drunk so much of his own bathwater that he no longer has a balanced or accurate view of the world. And if he was a real national leader that cared at all about the people that he governs, I don't know what he's governing these days, but whatever he's got, he would have long ago said enough is enough and stopped. But I think he was promised the world by Boris Johnson at our behest back in March and April of last year. And now all of a sudden, he's beginning to figure out he was lied to, but it's too late. So where does he go? He has nowhere to go.
Oh, wow. Unbelievable. I don't know if you saw this, but former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, I think it was yesterday or the day before, had two Russian pranksters that pretended to be Volodymyr Zelenskyy. They get him on a Zoom call and they humiliate him. These are the same people that, I don't know how this happened, but a few months earlier, they get Jerome Powell, the head of the Federal Reserve of the United States, probably more powerful than the president because it revolves on financial stuff, that they get these guys on the phone and prank them and publicly embarrass them to the world. How does something like this happen? Is there just no checkpoint? Are people so their ego so touched by the fact that Zelenskyy would reach out to them? I was completely flabbergasted.
Why is the president of the Federal Reserve talking to someone about U.S. foreign policy?
That's a better question.
No, I mean, there's no leadership in the White House. No one's in control. You have multiple actors that are pulling together in a general direction, but each one is trying to maximize his power, his influence, and his exposure. So whether that's Chuck Schumer or Biden or Blinken, everyone's out there in front of the cameras trying to make a name for themselves. As a result, no one person is really in charge of anything. And that's clearly the case with Biden. So the idea that the Fed would take a call from any foreign head of state is absurd. First, you say, well, he's not available. I'm calling the White House. Make the president aware that, he was allegedly just called by some head of state, but you don't talk to them. There's no business talking to them. And the second thing is, and you were talking about Henry Kissinger. Kissinger used to spend most of his time looking at polls in the 1970s and early 80s to see where he stood in them. Even when he was Secretary of State, even when he was the National Security Advisor, he wanted to see polls all the time about himself. I think he's desperate for attention. I mean, he's over 100 years of age right now. He's very fortunate that he has his marbles and he's still alive, but he's still desperate for attention. And I would chalk it up to that. He'd take a call from, the Prime Minister of Bhutan if he called. So these two characters have made fools out of all sorts of people. By the way, they spoofed the president of Poland, Duda, dumb enough to get on there and talk for the same reason. This is just crazy nonsense. So all of these leaders are anxious to be movers and shakers. They all want attention in the press, and they lose their sense of balance. And I think that's a huge problem right now. We have too many people that want so much attention from the press. And attention doesn't equate to substance, but they don't care about substance. They just want the flash and the bang.
Yeah. For the record, last year, a different group of Russian pranksters were able to get former President George W. Bush on a Zoom call, and they embarrassed him too. Oh, hey guys, I'm a fighter pilot just like you. Oh, it was embarrassing. It was absolutely
it's a shame.
embarrassing.
Yeah.
Okay, final question. Last week, I did an interview with former CIA Ray McGovern. He pointed out that the American people are allowing the federal government to abuse taxpayer money, print money for Ukraine, and back this humanitarian crisis simply because it's not American men and women that are dying. He basically insinuated that the military industrial complex is in a better position than they've ever been. They can take in as much taxpayer money as they want, and they don't have to deal with any of the questions of why are American soldiers dying for this money. Somebody else gets to die and they get to make billions in profits. Is there any truth to what he's saying? I thought it was a really brilliant observation, but I might be wrong.
Well, I'm afraid Ray is correct. And this is not the first time. If you go back and look at the history of the British Empire, most of the time from 1815 until 1914, people didn't pay much attention to what was happening overseas inside the empire. Now, a possible exception was the Boer War, because the 30,000 or 40,000 tough-minded Boers turned out to be a very hard nut to crack for the British military, which was anachronistic and woefully unprepared to deal with them. But with that exception, nobody paid much attention to what happened. I mean, we had a government under Disraeli fall in 1879 when 20,000 Zulus killed 1,100 British soldiers in one day. People were shocked. How could this happen to the British Army? You know, how could a bunch of tribesmen in Africa defeat the British Army? Disraeli had a no confidence vote, and he was bounced out of office. So that's what everybody in Washington fears, the Disraeli effect. They don't want to report that 1,100 Americans have been killed. That gets attention. It also reminds me, as some of your viewers will remember, of Clinton back in the 90s in a tug of war for power with, I guess it was the Speaker of the House, whose name escapes me at the moment, Newt Gingrich. And Newt Gingrich decided to shut the government down, stop spending. And I remember a newsman in San Francisco stopped a young man on his bicycle. He had a case of beer strapped to the back and said, "Would you talk to us?" He said, "Sure." He said, "Well, what do you think about what's happening in Washington?" And he said, "What do you mean?" "Oh, well, they're shutting the government down." "Oh." He said, "Well, I guess that's okay. It doesn't make much difference to me. As long as I can buy my case of beer, I can drive home and watch the game on TV. I don't care what they do." And ultimately, Newt Gingrich lost that tug of war because he thought Americans would be enraged at the government being shut down. They really weren't. They weren't until the possibility existed that the various redistribution plans would not be in effect. Of course, it never got that far. So I guess the truth is that Ray is correct, and I don't think most Americans are paying any attention to what's happening in Ukraine, if they even know where it is. And this is the advantage that the ruling elites in the globalist world have right now in Washington. They can play with other people's lives, other people's money, as long as they're not putting American lives at serious risk. But that, as I said before, could all change in a minute or two, depending upon stupid actions over which we increasingly don't seem to have a lot of control.
Yeah. Wow. Well, this has been a very insightful conversation. I know how busy you are. Took me a couple weeks to get you back on the schedule, so I appreciate you coming on and sharing your wisdom, your service to our country. I want to wish you a great rest of your day, and thank you again so much for coming on and sharing your knowledge.
Sure, Steve. Thank you.